You are now listening to the Hot Take Podcast, brought to you by Full Time Fantasy. Here are your hosts, Stephen Taroni and Josh Daly. Time to make it hot.
Welcome in. This is the Hot Take Podcast. I am excited to talk fantasy football once again with you folks. It's a beautiful day, and we are going to get into some of the latest news. We are going to talk about some Clyde Edwards-Helaire hype train. It is out of control, but look, I certainly get it. And we're going to get into some wide receiver talk. We're going to talk maybe some ADP sandwiches coming up here. You know, we like our sandwiches around here on the Hot Take. I am joined, as always, by Josh Daly. Josh, how's it going, buddy?
Going good, brother. Got some breaking news to talk about, and some news that actually happened pretty much as soon as we were done recording last time. So we'll catch up on that. But yeah, excited to kind of go through some of the news here. Excited to talk with our guests, and maybe eat some sandwiches.
Yeah, that Bad Santa. Shout out to that little boy in Bad Santa. Always infamous for the sandwiches. Thanks for reminding me. We have to shout out our guest today. Special guest on the show today. Very excited to have back on the show Marcas Grant and James Koh, both returning for, I believe, would be their third time each on the show. And we're going to have them on together for a little NFL Network reunion. But let's talk about some of these opt-outs. Now, last week, we were like, oh, yeah, pretty light on the opt-outs, nothing too fantasy relevant. And as soon as we ended our show, Damien Williams of the Kansas City Chiefs, of course, is opting out. So we are going to get into that a little bit more later about what that means for Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who has spiked up into the late first round, maybe early second round, but don't count on it in most formats at this point. But other opt-out news, we got a pair of Dolphins receivers, Allen Hurns and Albert Wilson. Now, along with that news, Preston Williams has been cleared to play. Josh, how are you feeling about this right now? I mean, do you think that Preston Williams is going to be healthy enough to be as productive as he was last year?
Yeah, definitely interesting with the timing, my man. They announced this, he gets cleared on, what was that, Monday, late Monday, and then, Tuesday, and now on Wednesday we get the consecutive days of news that both Hurns and Wilson are opting out. I tell you, the one thing that's interesting is if you remove both of these guys from the equation last year, and I know neither Hurns or Wilson played a full season. And that being said, it kind of even amplifies this point even more, but that automatically opens up 110 vacated targets. So when you look at Preston Williams, just this clarity, this sudden clarity in the receiving room for the Dolphins it's kind of interesting and very appealing. I know you and I have both been high on Preston Williams.
That's right. Yeah. And, Preston Williams, we saw that Ryan Fitzpatrick was targeting him very heavily. I think that Ryan Fitzpatrick is going to do a lot for Preston Williams in fantasy. You bring up Mike Gesicki and the other pass catchers, super relevant. You're going to get them at really, really cheap prices this year in redraft.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Sony Michel and Jarvis Landry both on the PUP list. Now, we were talking off air, Josh. It looks like that Jarvis is quote on time. Now his schedule was always around that like week one.
Yeah. And I think that's as soon as they announced that, it was kind of a surprise to some. There was whispers that this was going to be a possibility. Of course, when you're dealing with your hip and you're a receiver and you have to make these cuts, that's a pretty important injury to overcome. Some can be more serious than others, of course, with the Tua news for the draft. I mean, that was like the main storyline for the 2020 draft. But, Mary Kay Cabot comes out immediately after this news, and she tweets that basically the announcement, like, he'll be fine. They've expected this the whole time, that this was the timeline. So I'm not worried about Jarvis at all. I'm a huge Juice stan, so this is my guy, and I'm not letting it affect my current rankings, and I really don't think it should be affecting anybody else's rankings. If anything, all it does is just justify with how lowly he's been ranked on a lot of boards. I've thought he's been underranked and underrated, this whole time. So it's so if anything, it just kind of I've really, with that being built in, I don't feel like there's a need for him to slip any further.
And I mean, I feel like you could say similar things about Sony Michel. It's someone you can get in the 7th, 8th round. We've talked about him before. Now he's on the PUP list, and we've kind of, we were alluding to that being the case potentially. Yeah, I'm thinking that this is a little bit more serious. Like, he could actually miss a couple games, or his value could actually, you could actually get him at a cheaper price if people think he's going to miss games and he doesn't. So it's very interesting there with Sony.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were joking a couple weeks ago before we were talking when we had last week, we had our, we talked about the Patriots backfield, and we were kind of joking, like, because we talked about on a lost episode of this show. So there's no proof that I like JJ Taylor out there, but we joked about JJ Taylor, and I said, it's not totally out of the realm of possibility if Sony gets put on the PUP, and somebody opts out. So that player so far has been Brandon Bolden,
right?
And we talked about that. Rex Burkhead does contribute on special teams, and so I think he's probably going to be like that main guy for them. He is going to be back on the roster. He should get a boost in touches just with that absence of Sony, whether it's the first half of the year or if it plays out into something major, or if Frank Caliendo / Bill Belichick can kind of talk him into maybe it's not worth it. Maybe sit this one out. But it's weird. It's like I want to post the "it's happening" gif, with for JJ Taylor. But I think realistically, you have to look. There's one more big hurdle to clear there, man, and that's Damien Harris, who I don't know. I don't know how to feel about it, because he was used so sparingly in 2019 that I'd still think that he would be a better option than a rookie you're bringing in on an extremely abbreviated training camp period with everything going on.
Yep.
I still think Harris would be first in line to get some of those touches, with, of course, some shaved off to Burkhead, and maybe we do get some JJ Taylor in there. That would be excellent to see. But it's probably something where Harris is going to be the main benefactor.
Yeah, people are doubting Harris because of the lack of touches last year. I would say don't look into that at all. When the Patriots want to use a player, they'll use them, and they'll use them often. And it might happen out of nowhere, but just look at what's going on. If Sony misses 8 games, and who else is there? It's Burkhead, it's James White, it's Damian Harris. Who's going to get the bulk of those carries? Who's going to get?
And last year was 250. Yeah, 250 carries. Well, 247, but 125, 120 carries. If you're going to split half of that first 8 weeks, hey, man, somebody could really produce with 120 carries. I mean, James White, he is what he is, but they do, tend to give him some handoffs here and there. So it wouldn't surprise me to see him get a little uptick in carries too. It could be, just a more sophisticated mess in 2020.
I just want to see one formation of Jarrett Stidham in at quarterback, and they line up Cam at the running back. I mean, do that for me, please. I just want to see that once on the goal line. And Bill Belichick would do something like that.
Oh, Cam Newton's one of the best goal line backs in the NFL. Why not?
Why not? There you go. So, speaking of training camp, coach speak, all this, I just saw on Twitter right before we got on here, Ian Rappaport had a direct quote from Bruce Arians. Rojo is the main guy. That's Ronald Jones, running back of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Shady McCoy will contribute in the passing game. So that's cut and dry. Josh, are you looking into this at all? I mean, do you believe what Bruce Arians says? I mean, this is the guy who said that Chris Godwin was going to catch 100 passes last year. Chris Godwin almost caught 100 passes last year.
Oh yeah, it's weird because this one statement, I think, kind of just things getting really clear in Florida. Today it's it offers clarity on a couple of levels here. Not only do we see perhaps a downgraded projection for Dare Gumbalai's passing production, with what he did last year. I mean, it wasn't like he was severely impressive. I mean, he only caught 35 balls, but he was also used pretty sparingly. I thought that he and Tom Brady would have a fairly solid connection. And it appeared that way until like the day they signed McCoy. So that's kind of telling, especially with this current quote. And then it also sheds some light on the entire situation with the Keyshawn Vaughn truthers and the Ronald Jones. Rojo being the lead guy is definitely not what half of the fantasy community was expecting. But it is early. And I mean, when you look at just kind of the way each running back has contributed from their, previous situation, and then of course you're talking about, one rookie coming into the equation. It's definitely turned into kind of a 4-back cluster there. But this quote does offer some clarity, which is nice to see.
Ronald Jones last year, 172 carries, 724 yards at 4.2 a clip, 6 touchdowns, 31 receptions. Isn't that an okay year? Are we saying that's an awful year? That's pretty dang good considering it was his second year. He's still only 22 years old. So he bulked up. What do Tom Brady led offenses do traditionally? They score a lot of touchdowns in the red zone, and they run the ball a lot, especially 5-yard line and under. We think about LeGarrette Blount and random guys, like Jonas Gray and people like that are just pounding the rock in.
Right.
Who was the other guy? Gillislee, right? I mean, these were relevant guys, and this Tampa Bay offensive line has improved. Who is the guy? Who's the thumper? I mean, Keyshawn Vaughn, I get it. If you were a Keyshawn Vaughn guy and he lands in this situation, certainly understandable. I think for 2 years now, any free agent, any rookie, the ideal landing spot was the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And you're a Keyshawn Vaughn guy and he lands on Tampa Bay, I get it. You're ecstatic. But what does Bruce Arians do? I mean, what did he do with David Johnson, who was really damn good? I mean, he was losing out carries to Chris Johnson, So I think that Ronald Jones right now, just to me, is the clear guy to get the majority of the workload and the majority of relevant carries in the red zone. He's going to be that guy. And then I think what Shady McCoy offers Tom Brady is just a veteran presence. I think that Tampa Bay feels good about having just a veteran running back there. I mean, there really isn't anyone until they signed Shady. So it was kind of almost needed, even though I guess from the fantasy realm, you don't think they need another running back, but they kind of did in that sense. So I think they just feel more comfortable going in with him. Yes, he's going to steal some touches away from Rojo, but I really don't think it's going to be anything significant where you're going to be I still think that Rojo can get 12 to 15 carries a game is where I'm at right now.
Right. Yeah. And it's, you just want to know who's going to be the Ben Jarvis Green Ellis of the bunch. Right. It's but it can be more of a win now team. You bring in Brady, Gronk and Shady. I mean, I don't think I've seen a trio of free agent acquisitions, older than this group, but an interesting win now experience triumvirate. So we'll see kind of how that plays out going forward, my man. You kind of led into it already. We have some repeat appearances here. Never together though, so excited to be welcoming on not only Marcas Grant but also James Koh together here at the same time. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. How are we doing this evening?
We're good. Yeah, it's funny because Koh and I keep running. We hadn't done a pod together for 2 years, and now I think this is the third one we've done together in 3 weeks. So.
It's outrageous.
No, it's been great, man. It's been great to kind of chop it up again with MG, my guy, and it's good to be on this podcast as well, man. Man, it feels like I haven't done podcasts in 2 years or something. What's my deal? I don't get it. What have I been doing?
Well, we're super happy that you're back in the game, of course, and then you're working on the micropod that you've been doing, right? It's a quick 15-minute quick hit sort of thing.
Oh, not even. It's 5 minutes. It's called the Fantasy 5. It's literally just 5 minutes, and it's just fantasy. When the season gets going, there'll be some, sports gambling stuff in there too, which should be a lot of fun. I was never allowed to talk about it, but it's like I've been like gambling on, sports for so long. And it's funny because like it's only now kosher to talk about it. But yeah, no, I've been doing it for, 20 some odd years or something. So it's been great. But no, but yeah, the podcast, look, man, I would love for people just to give it a try. Okay. It's 5 minutes long. It's not very much time. It comes out 3 times a week. Listen to it whenever you want. It's quick, it's simple, it's easy. I just hit some major headlines and I give deep sleepers, I give regular sleepers, I'll give overvalued, undervalued players, and it's stuff like that. So I would love for people to give it a try. And if you don't like it after 2 episodes, give it another 2 episodes. And if you don't like it after that, maybe we can talk. But I think you will enjoy it. I really do believe in it. And this whole micropod thing is something that I really believe in as well. And I'm trying to start a little micropod movement. So there you go.
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, in theory, even if someone did listen to 4 or 5 episodes, that's like half of a normal podcast. So like,
right.
What do you guys have to lose? But yeah, we thought we were original getting both of you guys on here at the same time. And of course, our shout out to our boy, Ben Eby, who's actually in the Hot Take inaugural Dynasty League.
That's right.
We want to give him a quick shout out. He actually beat us to the punch. So not very original, but we wanted to at least have you guys on so we kind of chop it up here. And of course, Steve and I were just talking like beforehand. He said, I'm sure you guys. He said, I'm sure you watched James and Marcus, back in the day. And of course, like anybody that was into fantasy at that point in time, we were talking about how it was pretty much like the only thing that was really on fantasy related. So it was nice to kind of have that as someone, people like us are huge fantasy aficionados. We strive to have that programming on our TV. That's something that we're really going to enjoy. So like, of course we used to watch, and wanted to ask you guys, how did you guys kind of get started, and like what led you guys both to the NFL Network and getting on NFL Fantasy Live, where you guys used to kind of appear regularly together?
I sort of ended up here by accident. Like this was not a planned career move for me. I had been working in radio for a long time, and my radio opportunities had sort of dried up for reasons beyond my control. I had been recommended by a former coworker to apply for jobs at the NFL, that they were always looking for people. I literally went on the website, applied for like 4 or 5 jobs. I mean, 'cause at the time I was just sitting at home freelancing and watching reruns of Law and Order SVU. So I applied for 4 or 5 jobs. Didn't hear back from any of them. Now, mind you, I also did this in 2011, like during the midst of the lockout. People weren't even sure if there was going to be a football season. Here we are 9 years later, and people aren't sure if there's going to be a football season because time is a flat circle. So I went months without hearing anything and kind of forgotten about it. And then got a call from Michael Fabiano one day asking if I wanted to interview for a job writing about fantasy football. And I was like, does it pay? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, sure. So the night before the interview, I read a bunch of his columns, and I just basically regurgitated his own information back to him, and was able to get the job. I got offered the job the day the lockout ended. He called and offered me the job, and I started kind of as like a glorified copy editor, just editing stuff that he and Adam Rank wrote. Was able to kind of write a few blog posts here and there, and just have been fortunate enough to work my way up into being on the podcast, now hosting the podcast, being on Fantasy Live. I mean, literally, if we have a season, this will be season number 10 for me. And it's kind of amazing because this is easily the longest I have ever been at one job in my entire life. So it's kind of amazing.
I guess imitation was the sincerest form of flattery.
Man, there
right.
is so much to take away from Marcus's story. One, first of all, I mean, hell of a finesse move, right? To basically do that research and regurgitate that info. But that's like just solid life info right there. Like if you're applying for a job, like you got to be doing that, you know? Like I'm always surprised by the number of people who go into job interviews just cold, you know? It's like, what y'all doing, man? Like they got Google, you know? Just Google this stuff a little bit.
They got it.
Right. Just go visit the website at least. Do something.
I know, man. And like, yeah, I mean, you could like research what people like that your interviewers maybe even. I don't know. Anyways, that's for a different pod. But you know, it's like another thing that I took away from that too. It's like if you know Fabs at all, it's like, you know, playing up to his ego is like the exact right move to make. You know what I mean? So that surprises me 0% when I heard that story.
Well, go ahead, James. I mean, same question to you. Like, how did you get started in the fantasy field? I mean, you said that you were, you know, doing the gambling thing for like 20 years. So you have that experience. What is that kind of how you started with sport?
No, because the NFL and they're still this way. I'm no longer with them, so I can say this, but they explicitly say you cannot talk about gambling.
By the way, Roger Goodell, I am not talking about it. I am not saying a word about it. So Roger, if you're listening, I just want you to know that.
Exactly. That's what I'm talking about. You're not allowed to talk about it. Not even allowed to make references to it. You're not even allowed to make like little, you know, Al Michaels style side jokes about it. You're just not allowed to do it. And you just can't. So no, that you had to keep like super, super under wraps. If you did that. And they actually have like really strict rules too about like if you go to a casino, you can't go to a sports book, stuff like that. So it's just for me, it was a long journey, you know, because and it was the same way for Marcus too. But I feel like no one in fantasy ever started thinking like, oh, well, maybe, I mean, for you young cats nowadays, like you're like, oh, I want to be, you know, the next Marcas Grant. I want to be the next Matt Harmon or whatever, you know. But I think when MG and I were coming up, and we're both in, you know, Club 40 here, but when we were both coming up, like no one really thought about fantasy football as a career. I know I love the game. I've been playing, you know, for more than 20 years. And I just never thought of it as a career, but I did want to do sports broadcasting as a career, and that's kind of where I started my whole journey. I did radio for a couple of years. I worked in small market television stations for 4 years, but that's basically how I got to NFL Network. You know, like I actually did news. Like I was a local news reporter, and I did local news reporting in Bakersfield, in San Diego, and in Los Angeles. And I didn't actually, this was all with the goal of doing sports down the road. And when I got to LA, I actually did get an opportunity to be their weekend sports anchor. And we did a little bit of fantasy there. I mean, I did like MMA, basketball, baseball, all that stuff, you know, it was cool. But eventually I got an interview with the hiring manager at NFL Network, because my agent at the time like called in a favor. I basically told her straight up, I'm like, hey, listen, I don't feel like you're ever going to get me a job in sports, so I'm probably going to go with a different agent. And she's like, whoa. Okay, hold up. And like in like 3 days, she's just like, all right, you got this lunch meeting with this guy at NFL Network who's like my buddy. But he told me that it's not an interview, so don't like, you know, you can do whatever you want, but he said it's not an interview. I was like, all right, great. Go in and get this lunch meeting with this dude. And you know, I just started talking about like, hey man, like this is why I'd be a great addition to the team, and like blah 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 blah. And it was funny because he's like, this is not a job interview. Just so you know, it's not a job interview. I was like, all right, great. So we start talking about stuff, and like 45 minutes later, he starts asking me about my contract and about like what I would look for salary and like stuff. And I'm just like, I thought this wasn't a job interview. And so we laughed about it, but you know, and it took a while, but it was something like 6 months later, I ended up landing over at NFL Network, so it was good. And then, yeah, I was there for 4 years, and Best time of my life, man. I got to meet some great people like Marcus, Adam Rank, Matt Harmon, franchise, Alex Gelhar, and all them, and a lot of the guys at .com were wonderful. So it was a special time in my life for sure.
And real quick, when did you guys start with NFL Fantasy Live?
I was on the show. Yeah. I was hired to do that show. That's what the guy hired me to do, and that's kind of why I was there. I think Marcus was on it from the get-go. For at least for a long time. Marcus, correct me if I'm wrong, but like the whole time I was there, you were on it, right?
Yeah. Now the show had existed. Obviously before I started working there, the show existed. Right. I mean, just the quick history of Fantasy Live. It started off as I think like a 30-minute online only show, and I think some of the producers, guys who are no longer there, but they really pushed and prodded and convinced the network to actually put it on actual television. I had been working there. It might have been my second season there when I wrote something for the website and one of the producers read it and was like, "Hey, do you want to come on the show and talk about it?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure, why not?" And so full disclosure, I think I was on that one time and I didn't have any real suits or anything like that. I had a corduroy blazer that I wore and everybody called me the professor because I looked like some like liberal arts college professor at that point. So that was like the one time I did it. I obviously didn't screw it up because they invited me to come back for like, a day or two a week the next season. And it just sort of snowballed into that. Now I'm, on every day.
That's and awesome. By the way, his suits have just gotten immaculate from his corduroy jacket. Come on. The guy's looking suited up now, bro. I love it.
That's what's up. And like when you guys like just first started like working together, was that kind of how you met? And then it just kind of went from there. And you guys, because I know like, you guys and Harmon, you guys have definitely posted pictures of you guys drinking. It's well known that you guys are like, tight. So it's like, did it start from work and they kind of blossomed into like a genuine friendship there?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know James until he started working at the network and working on the show. I mean, that was how we met, and it turned into the podcast. And one of the things that I always wanted to do was knowing that we were all going to spend a lot of time together between writing and the podcast and the TV show. Like I wanted to set up so that we would actually be friends, and so we would do happy hours every week and we would hang out. And I think that's the one thing, James, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like that was the one thing that made our pod popular and successful, was that like people got the sense that we were actually legitimately friends in real life, because we actually were. And I just thought, the fantasy stuff was good. I thought our analysis was good, but I just felt like people enjoyed listening to 4 or 5 guys who were actually friends get together and do a podcast.
Yeah, I mean, that's 100%. I mean, you hit it right on the head, and what, around the NFL has got going on with their Room Full of Heroes is what we had building as well on the NFL Fantasy Life podcast. It was such a shame that they broke it all up and they didn't value what we had. It's really interesting. NFL media it's like they're cutting edge and also blind to cutting edge. And I'll explain, like they had a Madden show that did extremely well, but it was the first, weekly Madden show ever on network TV. And the way they did it, it was awesome, man. And it was a great show. Then they decided to cancel it. And then a year later, everyone's doing esports. So it's like they were 2 years ahead of the curve. And if they had just stuck with it, it would have been gangbusters. It would have been a great show. Then they lost it.
Adam Rank hosted that show, right?
Yeah.
Yes, part of it Adam Rank was hosting that show.
Adam Rank, we joke with him about this. He has this really bad track record of shows that he's on getting canceled. Like there were about 4 or 5 shows that Adam Rank, either was the host or like a prominent, member of, and like they all get canceled like after a season. Like we joke with him. He's sort of the kiss of death for a lot of things.
It was because what was it? It was the Madden show. It was Fantasy and Friends that he did with Damashek. That was a one seasoner.
He did a thing called The Weekender, which if you're familiar with The Soup on E,
Yeah.
It was sort of like The Soup, but obviously football themed. So that was one that got
was
canceled.
one season.
And then we did this past season. We did NFL Fantasy League 1, and
is that canceled?
That's not coming back.
Spoiler alert. Geez.
So yeah, Adam Rankus, he was the unfortunate kiss of death to a lot of things.
Right.
That's
we love
funny,
you,
man. He's wonderful, by the way. But
He
yeah,
really
no,
is.
yeah. I mean, so yeah, no, we had a really, really special thing going on with the fantasy podcast in particular. The show was a little bit more, I don't want to say disjointed, but it had a lot more, the cast was a lot bigger, right? So the fantasy podcast, you knew who was going to be on, you know?
Right.
You knew every single episode it was going to be me, Marcus, Franchise, Harmon, and Alex Gelhar. You knew it. And every single week, that's what you got. And it was a great podcast. So this goes back to, like I said, NFL media's kind of history, right? Like, so they had these podcasts going, and again, I mean, you got to remember, like, 4 years ago, podcasts were developing, you know what I'm saying? It wasn't like this, like Joe Rogan wasn't selling his podcast for $100 million back 5 years ago. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like that kind of money didn't exist back then. And so, yeah, they gave us this platform and we took it and ran with it, and it was really gaining some steam. I mean, we were really making inroads, man. I'm telling you. And then they just, and then all of a sudden they're just like, we're just going to let everybody go. And it's like, whoa, what happened, man? That was crazy.
Oh, yeah.
So, so like I said, they've done a good job with kind of like being ahead of the trend and then like not following through with the trend. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So that's kind of sort of where they've been.
Well, no, I mean, you know, and if you look at a podcast like the Fantasy Footballers, I mean, those guys, I think can be looked at as, one of the best, if not the best in the industry because of the camaraderie. And it's an independent podcast, but exactly right. If the NFL could have looked at that as like, well, this is what people like, they would have never broken you guys up, and you guys would be certainly doing better than what they're offering now. I'll say that, just pretty, and that's my opinion. I mean, I when I first got into the industry, it was James Koh was who I was looking at. Marcas Grant was who I was looking at, and that was big for me. And it was definitely a shame for guys like me and Josh who were tuning in all the time. So but it's awesome to have you guys here, and thanks for sharing your stories for sure. But let's actually get into some fantasy football talk here. And we didn't get a chance to talk about this last week, but the Clyde Edwards-Helaire hype train it's in the first round. That's where it's at, because you're not walking out of a draft with Clyde Edwards-Helaire if you don't draft him in the first round. So Josh, I'll get your thoughts real quick and then we'll toss it up to our guest. But I mean, you were the Clyde Edwards-Helaire truther from the get-go.
Yeah, actually, in our startup league, ended up making a trade so I could go up and get CEH. I've just always been an Andy Reid running backs truther, to be honest with you. Just insert Andy Reid running back here, and then you can put my name after it as being a truther. But with what we have going on, it's the same thing every year. I mean, last year, all these articles coming out, is Damien Williams really a first round running back? I mean, last year was probably like one of those lone exceptions. Of course, anyone who watched the playoffs the last 2 years know what Dame did, just elite fantasy production there. But it's the same thing every year, for all the way from 2004, all the way to 2017, Kareem Hunt's rookie year. You're looking at technically, 04 to 16, 19 and a half points a game. It's exactly what Kareem Hunt got you in 2017. And then, he's NFL rushing leader. 2018, that goes up to 20.8 points, PPR points per game. And then, like I said, last year kind of being like that one exception to the rule there. But I mean, my goodness, like the list of Andy Reid running backs goes on and on that have had success. Bryant Westbrook, LaShawn McCoy, Jamal Charles. We even had, a Spencer Ware season before Kareem Hunt came out. And it's unfortunate the way things unfolded for Kareem Hunt because, in that season in 2018, like I mentioned, he gave you 20.8 points a game. Now this is 11 games worth of production. But in 11 games, Kareem Hunt under Andy Reid gave you 7 receiving and 7 rushing touchdowns, 14 total touchdowns. And of course, the way things unfolded there, quite unfortunate. But when your franchise QB, your $500 million man, goes and he tells you like, hey, he tells the staff, hey, this is the RB I want. Watch out, man, because we know what Mahomes can do. Andy Reid's offense has always been explosive and productive for fantasy running backs, and with Mahomes at the helm, I mean, it's incredible. I told you, Steve, before we came on, been in some best ball drafts here in this past week, and I mean, you're not getting Clyde Edwards-Helaire after 110. I mean, he's pretty much going at 110 in the last week or so. But since this news broke with Damien Williams opting out, he's been like the RB7 on average, and that's rising. So I wouldn't be surprised to see if CEH actually the RB6 by the time we get our podcast out and on the airwaves.
So Marcus, I have it written here on the show sheet. When is the earliest you take him? Is he a clear first rounder? But I'm going to make this a little bit harder for you because I think that's too easy of a question. I know you're a Kenyon Drake guy. So, I mean, who are you going to take him over Kenyon Drake right now?
See, here's the thing. I've been sort of mealy-mouthed on CEH just because I felt like Damien Williams was going to get some opportunities. Obviously, that's not the case anymore with Williams having opted out. I mean, I guess if you're forcing me to make a decision, which I guess you are right now, I would take CEH over Kenyon Drake just because. Look, if you're asking me to pick between the Chiefs offense and the Cardinals offense, it's going to be the Chiefs offense all day. Like, there's no real debate there. Right. Look, and I loved Kareem Hunt, right? Like, I was maybe the biggest Kareem Hunt truther when he came out of college. But let's also remember, Kareem Hunt got that opportunity because of injuries. Like, he wouldn't have had that shot there. So maybe it's the same thing for Edwards-Helaire. I don't know. Something about it, and I can't put my finger on what it is. Something about it just doesn't feel right this year. And so I don't think I'm going to have him on any rosters because I'm not going to feel comfortable pulling the trigger at the spot I need to in order to get him. Right. And so, look, I know that's what the consensus is. If he's going to be a first round guy, I just don't think I could. I don't think I have the guts to make the move for him at that spot.
So real quick before we get to you, James, that's kind of how I'm feeling with Clyde Edwards-Helaire, and what I've realized that it's doing is it's making guys like Nick Chubb, Josh Jacobs, Aaron Jones, just like more. They're at a value now. They're dropping a spot because CEH has plummeted into the first round. So, Aaron Jones was already a guy that you're getting at the end of all of these running backs. I mean, Joe Mixon, all of these guys are going ahead of Aaron Jones. So guys like that are going to be just more of a value now. I'm starting to kind of realize here. James, how are you feeling about Clyde Edwards-Helaire right now?
Yeah, I mean, I understand where Marcus is coming from. Certainly, he's a rookie running back. I hate to use this, the standard old trope of, he hasn't really, shown it before, but he's a number one lead dog on the league's best offense. And if you were just to put that in a vacuum and say, okay, this is the lead back, even if it's let's say it's like a 51-49 split, right? But this is the lead back, a first round pick, lead back on the NFL's best offense. Where are you taking that guy in a vacuum? Forget the names. Like you're definitely taking that dude in the first, not only in the first round, you're probably flirting with, a top 5 selection. Because he's attached to such a great offense. Now, what Marcus is talking about, I 100% co-sign that. I totally agree. Andy Reid, look, we know Andy Reid's going to play with our hearts, man. It's just what he does. I mean, you mentioned Spencer Ware for whatever reason. Do we remember when Kareem Hunt, for whatever reason, was getting taken out late game situations? So even when they were trailing, and they needed those little quick dump off. Like you had Kareem Hunt and you're like, oh my God, I need these dump off points. Please, for the love of God, give me these trash points right now. No, it was freaking Charkandrick West out there. Like that killed me. Like, why is Charkandrick West getting burned over Kareem Hunt? This doesn't make any sense. That's what Andy Reid is going to do. And that's what he has done for the better part of 10 years. I mean, you mentioned some of these other running backs, and they're all great players, no doubt about it. But, I'm sure there were times where you kind of just felt like, okay, they could have gotten more. And that's probably what's going to happen with CEH as well. I think he is obviously a top 10 pick. I don't think he's a top 5 pick. Right now on Fantasy Football Calculator, I think he's going 7. Yeah, he's going 7 right now, right after Michael Thomas and Dalvin Cook. So I feel like I want to say that's about right. I think 7 is about right for him. Yeah. But to be honest with you, and I addressed this in my latest podcast that dropped today, but I don't know why we are, for whatever reason, in PPR, why are we discounting Julio Jones? Why are we discounting Nuke Hopkins? Why are we discounting Tyreek Hill? At 7, after Michael Thomas, all of those 3 names should be up for consideration. If I'm picking 7, I will have a very difficult decision in front of me between CEH and those 3 wide receivers that I talked about. I didn't even talk about Devante Adams. Yeah, throw in another name. So very difficult decision there at 7 or 8, but certainly I think CEH deserves some consideration in that range.
I'll tell you this real quick too, because I'm in the midst of a semi-slow best ball draft, and I was in the 8th spot, and I really felt like, I'm like, what am I going to do if it comes down to it? And I'm at 8, and there's CEH, and pick a receiver, Devante Adams, Michael Thomas, what have you. I'm like, I'm really going to have a tough decision. Now, fortunately for me, somebody took Edwards-Helaire at like 4 or 5, so like that. Oh. So then I gladly snatched Michael Thomas at 1.08, and went on about my business. Right, I went on about my way. But I was like sort of dreading it. I'm like, I don't know if I don't know what to do if I have this decision. And I was just glad that somebody took that thing out of my hands.
And there you go, because Michael Thomas is going 6 or 7 usually after the slew of running backs, whether it's 5 or 6 of them, depending if Dalvin Cook or Derrick Henry are taken. So yeah, you got that value right there because he goes 1 spot back at 108. It's going to be tough. I agree with you, James. Like these receivers, like especially Nuke, I mean, that go into the late second round sometimes, it's great.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
The value is so depressed right now on that position. And you just think to 3 years ago when Antonio Brown was the consensus wide receiver 1, or I'm sorry, overall 1,
right.
101. And it was, Julio was probably 102 or maybe even 103. So obviously the landscape is changing every year, but you want to get ahead of that sort of thing. Do you not? I mean, you so if to your point, James, maybe you should be looking at these guys, because even Devante Adams sometimes goes into you can get him at the 203, 204 sometimes, depending on, these guys like I just mentioned. And
that's where Julio is going. He's going in the early parts of the second round, which to me is we're acting as if this guy just did not post a 100-catch season. Like, it's PPR, right. People. I'm just confused. Like, what are we talking about here? Nuke Hopkins had a 100-catch season. Like, what is there to think about? You know what I mean? So what? That we could take, unproven, fringe running backs? I don't know. For me, if I'm picking in Marcus's spot, I'm almost assuredly going wide receiver off the first 2 picks. That's just kind of where I'm going. Any pick after 8, unless CEH falls to me or something, or maybe somebody decides to get crazy and they want to get some of these wide receivers early, and I get an elite running back that falls to me. But I tell you what, man, I'm not investing. I'm not going to take Kenyon Drake ahead of Julio Jones. I'm just not going to do it, and Aaron Jones, forget about it. That guy is definitely going to see a huge touchdown regression. No, I'm not taking that guy in the second round. No, give me a wide receiver. I'm good.
Yeah, part of me thinks that it could be just a little bit of the running back player pool tends to thin out a lot quicker. So maybe it's just that some fantasy owners are comfortable with, the last 15, 16 years, if you took a shot on, Chiefs RB1 in the first round, you've only been wrong twice. So I feel like a lot of that could be baked into this, full steam ahead on the hype train, which does make sense. But at the same time, all the receivers that you just listed off, James, especially when you're talking about, like Marcus said, Devante Adams or Michael Thomas, I mean, it doesn't get much more consistent than that either. So I think that's what's really making this a super difficult decision for a lot of people there when you get in the back half of the first.
Right.
Yeah. But like we've talked about on this show, if you do want to go running back at that point, you still are probably walking away with like two studs, where if you're at the first pick and you get Christian McCaffrey and you go back to the end, all of those running backs could be washed up, where like, you can get like Josh Jacobs or Clyde Edwards-Helaire and come back and get Nick Chubb, or come back and get, Austin Eckler if you're an Austin Eckler guy. So that running back spot at that point, I also see the appeal. And I'm typically a wide receiver heavy kind of drafter, but I do see that appeal for the running back, especially at the back half of the first round this year.
I'll say this.
Clyde Edwards-Helaire being paired with a Nick Chubb. I mean, to me, that sounds pretty awesome to start off your team with Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who could be what we think he could be in that top 5-ish guy, to pair with a Nick Chubb who almost, led the league in rushing last year. That would just be a dream scenario, in my opinion.
Yeah, this is a reminder, by the way, that when we talk about draft strategies and that sort of thing, that like some of it is really contingent upon what everybody else in your draft is doing. Like I've always said, waiting on a quarterback is great when everybody's waiting on a quarterback. 0 RB is great when most of the people in your draft are waiting on running backs. You can't be a 0 RB drafter, or it's at least difficult to be a 0 RB drafter when everybody's snatching them up. When you have, 15 of your first 20 picks being running backs, it's hard to wait, because then you really are kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel. So right. I think, when people start talking about, these absolutes of going with one strategy or another, like, it sort of depends on what the folks around you are doing. That's going to dictate a lot of it.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And, when you're looking at most drafts, things do thin out, pretty quick there, especially when you're getting into, the 5th round or later. And one thing that still offers a lot of value is, the wide receiver position. So I feel like, especially with the way a lot of recent drafts have been trending, there's a handful of guys that tend to end up being there after that 5th round mark that you can kind of really bank on to be a productive, wide receiver 2, or in some cases, depending on how, like you guys just said, how your drafts go and how your roster build plays out, you might actually be able to land a solid wide receiver 1, after the 5th round. So it's kind of crazy. And so we'll actually talk about that real quick. And Steve, I'll throw it to you first, but wanted to get kind of an idea on what wide receiver you guys are kind of higher on than consensus at this point. So, Steve, I'll throw it to you first, and then we can get kind of your guys' take, Marcas and James, after that.
Yeah, I'll be pretty quick. Your guy, first of all, has been my guy, since the beginning of the offseason, where I'm looking, at the value that he was being taken in drafts and still is. But I'm also considering another receiver at that point right now. Will Fuller is volatile. I mean, he's going to miss time. I know that when I draft Will Fuller, but what he did last year in 11 games, he averaged 6.4 targets per game. And in 6 of those 11 games, he had at least 7 targets. He got double-digit targets twice. He got 9 targets once. This is all with DeAndre Hopkins on the field. So, I see Brandon Cooks come in, and I still think that Brandon Cooks is a fine receiver. He's not going to command 130, 140 targets. But that is on the table right now because DeAndre's 150 are out the door. So where are those going to go? Well, I think that Deshaun Watson, who, Josh, we've talked about this, he's going at a crazy value right now. He's not even being thought of in this first tier of quarterbacks where maybe we should still be thinking of him as that. I don't know why we're not. I have him as my QB6, so I'm guilty of that. But he's got these field stretchers, and one of them is, he already has that rapport with, and that's Will Fuller. I really see that 120 targets is very realistic, even if he plays 13 games. Like, I think that Deshaun Watson is actually going to pepper him with targets. If he just averaged 6.4 last season, who's to say that's not going to be closer to 7 this year when he's on the field? So, when it comes between Will Fuller and the guy that you're about to talk about, Josh, that's where I'm leaning with Fuller, because I really see a potential of high volume there.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Everything you said, I completely agree with, especially the Deshaun Watson comment. I mean, James, you're talking about some sports betting. I've been literally like money burning a hole in my pocket because I'm up here in Michigan, and sports books opened officially like the second week of March. Unfortunately, due to outside circumstances going on in the world right now, they closed like 3 days later. So I just haven't had time to get up and make it to a casino, because I think Watson's a great guy to throw down like some long shot MVP odds on. I think that those are a little bit understated there as well. But going to my guy real quick to kind of speed the segment along. Right in the middle of that fifth tier of receivers, currently going as the wide receiver 32 is Hollywood Brown, who, has got a fresh 23 pounds of muscle added on here.
We like that around here.
We just saw that news break, which is exciting. So you're thinking like, oh, he must be huge. He looks great. He's up to a swole 180 right now.
Okay.
But still, like, that's, still kind of on the smaller side, but perfect second-year breakout candidate. I mean, he's like my second-year breakout special, just massive upside, part of the super sophomore class. He was banged up a lot of last year, but he showed the upside when he was healthy and he was out there. I mean, we're talking about 7 touchdowns on 46 catches. I mean, of course, there's going to be some regression built in there, but that kind of ratio is just sick. But there's going to be more opportunity this year. I mean, I expect more targets because I think he's not only going to get an increased share. The Ravens threw the least amount of pass attempts in 2019. So like in general, the law of large numbers, that can only go up. And they played from behind very rarely. They finished the regular season 14-2. So that's not calling for your offense to just air it out a ton when you have, a ton of talent in the backfield. So you can just kind of pound away the clock there and game script dependent situations like that. But he gets deep balls, he gets end zone targets. And it doesn't sound that great that Seth Roberts and Hayden Hurst are leaving. But hey, it's still 75 vacated targets that kind of opens up, and it's mostly just rookie receivers coming in, and with an extremely abbreviated preseason. Hey man, I'll put my eggs in Hollywood Brown's basket all day.
And what we've talked about before, I mean, he's getting that depressed value because of the, like you said, that super sophomore class. I mean, all those other guys going way ahead of him, Hollywood Brown is the afterthought. So take that all day.
Yeah, absolutely. James, what about you? Who's kind of like a receiver that you're higher on than the consensus that's going in that round 5 range or later?
Well, I just wanted to kind of add on to what you were saying there first. Marquise Brown going somewhere in that 6th round range, a top 70 selection. And I agree with a lot of what you're saying. The guy was playing, I talked to him this offseason, and, he was playing largely at he said 50%. His foot was hurting every single day after practice, after games. He had screws put in. And now he says he feels like he's 100%. And he basically told me, he's like, look, man, I'm going to put the league on notice because he's got 4.2 speed and he's going over the top. You know what I mean? If you're going to try to bring down a box safety and you want to go single high with Marquise Brown throwing down, a 4.2 on the sides, running a 9, forget it. Even with, he only had 71 targets last year, but let's say that even goes up to 100 or 110. I totally think that he could get, 8 or 9 touchdowns on 100 targets. That's how crazy it is because what are you going to do? You can't run cover 2. I mean, I guess you could try, but it's really hard to stop Lamar Jackson in this running attack without creeping, some safeties down. So, and I don't think there's too many corners in the NFL that can stay with Marquise Brown one-on-one. So I'm on board with what you're talking about. Now, again, it gets a little bit dicey. He's going to have to turn into like some kind of like Tyler Lockett clone in terms of converting limited opportunities into production, but it's certainly possible. It's certainly possible, I mean, and I wouldn't bet against it.
If he gets 110 targets, like, you know, I mean, that he could be a borderline wide receiver one. I mean, that kind of volume would be insane with the kind of skill set he has.
Yeah, and at this point when we're recording too, like we're recording here the first week of August, but like last week, his ADP was like in the mid 60s, and he's taken a sharp dip for whatever reason. You know, and now he's back into like the early 70s. So it's kind of weird to see that over the last week. But you know, maybe the news of him being bulked up will pull that back up into like the 60s. So.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that he was playing at 160 pounds last year was just absolutely insane. But you talk about, you know, I feel, first of all, I feel like we could do this particular segment all day long because there's so many receivers that I think are going way too low. I think Marquise Brown is certainly a guy. I look at AJ Green as somebody who's going in the 6th round as well, you know, top 65 selection. I feel like Joe Burrow's coming to town, man. Like, I get that their offensive line looks like poops, but forget it. Like, AJ Green is still going to be the primary target there. But I really want to focus in on Devante Parker. You know, again, just outside the top 70 on Fantasy Football Calculator. And I understand where the hesitation is. Preston Williams, you know, is coming back. His first 8 games with Preston Williams, Devante Parker was not, you know, he wasn't lighting the world on fire, right? We're talking about a dude that averaged 11.5 PPR fantasy points per game. And then it was the last 8 without Williams. That's when he went gangbusters, right? He was the second highest scoring fantasy wide receiver the last 8 games of the season, averaged 19.3 fantasy points per game. Second only in both categories to the great Michael Thomas, right? But, and I think there's a lot of that narrative built in. I get it. But I would also say this, look at the teams he played in the first 8 games of the season. It was Baltimore, great secondary. New England, enough said. Dallas, Byron Jones. Chargers, Casey Hayward. Buffalo, Trey White. Pittsburgh with Minkah Fitzpatrick on full-on revenge game mode status, right? Like,
yeah, baby.
Look at all of these games. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of his first 8 games came against elite secondaries. That's tough. And he's still giving you 11.5 fantasy points per game. So I don't think, to me anyways, whether it's, you know, Fitzmagic or it's Tua, if it's Tua, great. But I just think Devante Parker last year put it together. You know, we're talking about a guy who finished the season extremely well. Like I said, back end of the season, the wide receiver 2 in the last 8 weeks of the season, right? Give me that guy in the 6th round. Are you kidding me? I don't understand how his ADP is not in the 4th round. I think his value is extremely depressed. And I understand the reasons why. I just disagree with him. And so for me, you know, once round 5 comes around and Parker's on the board, I'm snatching him up.
Yeah, and then year 2 of no Adam Gase, so always a bonus. Marcus, what about you? Who, like, are you a stand for a particular wide receiver, kind of after that wide receiver 30-ish range?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not after wide receiver 30. I mean, he's probably coming off before, but I know James is going to say I'm a homer. Maybe I am, but I think I'm bigger on Robert Woods than a lot of people are. Like, I feel like that gap between Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp should be closer than what it is right now in a lot of drafts because, you know, look, Woods really was kind of a jack of all trades for this offense last year, right? When Brandon Cooks was hurt, when they were trying to find some kind of spark, they moved Woods inside, they moved him outside. The other part of it is they've been using him on those jet sweeps, which we're always looking for ways to kind of pick up those hidden fantasy points wherever we can. And that was what Woods was doing by running the football. I think it's close to just shy of 300 yards rushing over the past couple of seasons. I think the only wide receiver with more is Cordero Patterson. And so, you know, that has been kind of a sneaky source of fantasy points from this guy. And even if it doesn't happen this year, because they do have a deeper stable of running backs, the fact that Brandon Cooks is gone, that he's now in Houston, means that there are a whole lot of targets that are going to be available there. And yes, Tyler Higbee is going to get some. I'm sure, whichever running backs they decide to throw to are going to get some of them. But there's a very real chance that Robert Woods could get close to or above 150 targets this year. And I know everybody looks at Cooper Kupp, and for good reason. I get it. He's definitely a security blanket for Jared Goff in that offense. But just at some point, I feel like we have to stop discounting Robert Woods, right? He's had back-to-back years in Los Angeles of being a very productive fantasy receiver. I know that when he first landed in LA from Buffalo, I remember when he first landed in LA, the press release that was sent out to announce it, it highlighted the fact that he was one of the best blocking wide receivers in the league, and we all kind of rolled our eyes at that. We're like, okay, sure, like this is what we're picking on, right, for the guy. But he has blossomed into being. Look, I mean, I watched him obviously at USC, and he is starting to look like that guy we saw playing for the Trojans all those years. And I think at some point, we need to start acknowledging that as such when we draft him. And I really do think that like that gap between him and Cooper Kupp needs to be a lot closer than it is.
Yeah, and good point. Even though, like you said, he's not technically outside of that top 30, but real quick point, if you're looking at Fantasy Pros consensus ECR rankings, he is the only receiver with a double-digit plus-minus when you're looking at the current ADP to current rankings until you get all the way down into like the wide receiver 46 and 45 range with Anthony Miller and Deebo Samuel. So higher, upper echelon here. Robert Woods solidly, I feel like, in that third tier of wide receivers, but a 10 pick difference between his, 26 ADP and his wide receiver, 16 price tag right now.
And Robert Woods like kind of sneakily gets like 150 yards on the ground. He might just run in a touchdown too. It doesn't do much, but I remember going into, I believe it was last year, I was looking at his running production along with Tyreek Hill. It was like identical. Like Tyreek Hill and Robert Woods had identical seasons, except, one just had a lot more yardage and a couple more touchdowns than Tyreek Hill. So yeah, 150 targets, not out of the realm of possibilities. I mean, they're going to funnel the targets to him and Cooper Kupp. I mean, that's what this offense is going to look like. That's what this passing offense is going to look like. I think that, I have Cooper Kupp ahead of Robert Woods because of the touchdown upside. But, if I could see Robert Woods getting something like 9-10 touchdowns, I think that they would be a lot closer.
And I do think that's part of the, like, talk about positive regression, right? I mean, Robert Woods, for all the work he did, had 2 touchdowns last year, right? It feels like that number's got to go up, right? So that's a big plus in his favor.
100%.
Agreed. I have him, having 5 or 6 touchdowns this year for sure. But if he gives you 150 targets, he's going to be borderline wide receiver 1 again. Let's get your guys' hot takes. I mean, we've been doing this now. We had Paul Charchian on, and he said that Zach Moss would outscore Devin Singletary in fantasy points. And I thought that was a pretty good way to start us off for the offseason hot takes here. So, Marcus, we'll start off with you, and then we'll go to James. What is your hot take for 2020?
My hot take is that by the end of the year, Jonnu Smith is going to win some people some fantasy leagues.
Okay.
Look, I know that everybody's talking about these late round tight ends that are hanging out there that have some opportunity to really produce this year. And I think Jonnu Smith is one of them. I mean, you look at that passing game there in Tennessee, right? We know A.J. Brown is going to do work. That's without a doubt. But, I mean, at this point, I feel like Corey Davis is going to slide into that spot that has been vacated by Devante Parker of the, hey, is this the Corey Davis breakout year? No, it's not. So like, where else are they going to go with the football, right? I mean, Ryan Tannehill, he's got to go somewhere. He can't go to A.J. Brown every single week or every single throw. Delaney Walker's not there anymore, so that means opportunity is opened up. And so I think Jonnu Smith is going to get a whole lot of looks in that offense, and especially because so many people are going to stream the position at tight end. I think Jonnu Smith is going to be a guy who's going to be very popular when we get down the stretch, and I think you're going to see him on quite a few, I think, championship fantasy rosters this year.
James, we'll bring it over to you. What is your hot take for 2020?
My hot take for 2020 is that Raheem the Dream Mostert will end up being a top 5 fantasy running back. Let's go.
Ooh,
Spicy.
I just think I love what he brings to the table in San Francisco. We know Shanahan is able to kind of coach these guys up. His scheme is just immaculate. You know, I had Raheem Mostert graded as one of the best outside running backs in the NFL last year, and that was on extremely limited touches. So I think Tevin Coleman's washed. I think he's been washed, and I think he will take another step back. I think Raheem Mostert will own about 60 to 70% of the running back shares, and in Shanahan's system, oh, forget about it. Give me Raheem Mostert. He's going somewhere in that 5th round right now. He's the RB26 off the board on Fantasy Football Calculator. My hot take for the season is that he vastly outperforms ADP, ends up the season as a top 5 fantasy running back.
Woo. Josh, what do you think about that one?
I like the spice meters pinging on that one. I like
I mean, we've talked about Raheem Mostert a lot on this show, and one thing that happened with the trade rumors is his ADP dipped, and I don't think it's come back like to where it should be. I think it still is dipped, and I'm in a best ball league right now with Ben Gretsch and a couple other guys in the industry, and I'm into 6'11", and I'm just waiting, and I see Raheem Mostert is just like falling and falling. I'm like, is he really going to make it to me at 6'11"? He didn't. It was like 6'09", but I was like, I will definitely take him at the point, and so in the 6th round, I think that's a great value.
Nice.
I think he's going entirely too low, man, and I think he's I just think he's got that explosiveness, and he understands the system. They're going to employ some kind of 2-back set. Obviously, Jerick McKinnon coming off of injury, but I mean, we haven't seen this guy since the Reagan administration. You know what I mean? I'm not worried about Jerick McKinnon, bro. You know what I mean? Like Tevin Coleman, at this point, Tevin Coleman looks like, I mean, I don't know, like he's a shell of the shell. You know what I mean? So I'm not too worried about Tevin Coleman either. And money matters. Money matters. And Raheem Mostert's chasing that bag. You know what I'm saying? So
this is his chance.
This is his chance. Like every run that he's taken to the outside right now, that's like he's looking at bags. You know what I'm saying? Like, give me that bag. Yeah. And I think money motivates, and he's in a great system. He himself is a great player. And I think he's just gonna explode. And he is a player. So like when I say, I'm going, wide receivers early, rounds 1 and 2, if I'm picking, 7 or later, it's because of guys like Raheem Mostert, Jonathan Taylor that I like in the 4th, 5th round, that I can take swings at. And if it doesn't work out, I got backup plans for days, so it's all good. But yeah, these are the dudes that I would be targeting if I did go wide receiver up top.
Is it fair to say that Tevin Coleman is a shell of what we thought he could have been? Like, he's not quite a shell of what he was, because he wasn't really much of anything, unfortunately. Like, and that's kind of the point, that adds to the point of Raheem Mostert, because there's a couple backs there, but they're not really inspiring anything. And Kyle Shanahan's going to give it to the guy who's producing. So if he can touch 200 carries this year, he's got that RB1 upside. And I think that, if he's going to get that top 5, then it's going to probably have to be more like 225 carries, something like that. But he can certainly be efficient in that offense. So
to tell you what people think of the backup Niners running backs, I've had multiple people ask me what I think of JaMychal Hasty. I think that says something.
Right.
The hot hand.
Jeff Wilson. Should I be like drafting him in the back of my no?
draft Jeff Wilson in your touchdown only leagues if anyone still does those.
Marcus, James, you guys are totally dope for coming on the show today. It was a lot of fun talking with you guys. Please just tell everyone what you guys have coming up for him. You can follow Marcus at Marcus G on Twitter. James at James D. Koh, K-O-H. So James, just real quick, where can people find I'm going to mess up the name. Hold on. Is it Fantasy in 5?
Fantasy 5, yeah, the Fantasy 5.
Yep.
It's, again, a 5-minute micro podcast. You can find it on Apple and Spotify. I think we're still working on Google. That process takes a little bit longer, but that's okay. Just if you go to my Twitter account or my Instagram, you can find the links there in my bio. And I think Marcus and I both do a pretty good job. He's got way more followers than me, so I can't imagine he gets to all of his questions. But I get to a lot of my questions, and but I do see Marcus pounding away on those Twitter keyboards, man. And so I know he does a great job of answering fan questions as well. So, we get a lot every single week, and I truly believe that we try to get to as many of the questions as possible. So that's just kind of my thing. If you want to reach out on Instagram or Twitter, by all means, at James D. Koh. And man, please just give my podcast a try. That's all I'm saying. Just give it a try and let's just see what happens.
Well, I can definitely attest to you guys being super responsive on Twitter, James. That's how you got on the show a couple of years ago. I think you said something like, "Hey, like I'm good to go on the guest spot." I hit you up right away, and it worked out. So if you guys have any questions, sure, reach out to James, please. And then Marcus, what do you have coming up for the season? I know that you've been doing your show in the off season. Anything that's going to be going on through the season as well?
Yeah, we're doing the podcast right now twice a week. That's going to up to 3 times a week once we start the season. Fantasy Live is going to come back in just a little bit too, so we'll be getting that going. Other than that, yeah, Twitter is probably the best place to find me, at Marcus G, and I try to tweet out as much stuff as I can there.
And then, Josh, I know that you had your article come out on Fantasy Pros recently. You had a piece on Jarvis Landry. Do you have anything coming out soon or during season?
Yeah, we've been pumping out a lot of those collaborative pieces. I pretty much took a crap all over Tyler Higbee earlier this week. And then I also have just a little piece. We're looking at some wide receivers that we think are currently overvalued. And I wrote a little bit about DeAndre Hopkins in there and why I just wouldn't probably take him at his current ADP. So feel free to check it out. You can also follow me at Josh Daly 72 on Twitter. And James, you officially have a new subscriber to the show.
Yeah, sweet.
You got one. No. James, Marcus, thanks so much for coming on the show. Of course, you can find the Hot Take podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. By the time you guys listen to this, we would have already recorded our live show with Ray GQ, but that's something we're going to do every week, going up towards the season, is do a live show. So be on the lookout for those. We're going to go on Thursday nights on the Full-Time Fantasy Twitter via Periscope, so be on the lookout for that. On behalf of our great guests today, Marcas Grant and James Koh, and my co-host Josh Daly, my name is Stephen Tironi. This has been the Hot Take Podcast.